After engaging in a series of public arguments with religious leaders in the temple, Jesus contrasts the proud and oppressive ways of those leaders with the sacrificial humility and poverty of the widow. A reading from Mark. As Jesus taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Please be seated. Now, I've found over the years that with smaller crowds, services always seem to go faster because it's easier for people to get up and down faster, and also communion goes a lot faster. But I want to tell you today that I will not take advantage of that. My sermon is going to be ordinary length. Today's Bible readings have the theme of widows, both in the Old Testament and the Gospel. Widows, widowers. To lose a husband or a wife is a difficult thing. If we believe the words of Jesus, and all of us here do, when you lose a spouse, you lose part of yourself because the husband and wife are one flesh. Many of you here today have lost a spouse and know firsthand how difficult it is. Many more have seen your parents or grandparents or friends deal with such a loss. But as tough as it is today, it was even tougher back in biblical times when you were bereaved. When you were bereaved back in biblical days, there was no life insurance, no Social Security, no counselors, and no grief support groups. When you became a widow back then, you often fell through the cracks of society. You suffered for a while, and then you died. That's why there were so many times in Scripture that the prophets spoke about reaching out to widows. Jesus also, and the New Testament writers spoke about widows. Jesus himself pointed out that they really had no one else. The widow in our Old Testament reading was beyond poor. She had only enough for one meal, and then she was prepared to die. Yet even then, the widow, in a reading from the Old Testament, had faith. This was a woman from the very beginning of her conversation with Elijah, talked about God. And she continued to believe in God when all traces of God seemed to have vanished as she got poorer and poorer. When her world and what she believed her life was ending, she still believed in God. So how do we know that she believed from the brief sentences from our Old Testament lesson? Well, when Elijah made his prophecy about the jar and the jug, she didn't laugh in his faith, as many a cynic would do, and as even Sarah did when God told her about a miracle that was going to happen. No, the woman did as she was told. She went home and made her meal, and her faith quite literally saved her life. The jug and the jar kept full all through a long time afterwards. Now let's look at our New Testament lesson, the widow there. The widow had exactly 2 cents to give. What is 2 cents or a penny? 2 small copper coins, not much bigger than the end of your fingernail, your pinky fingernail. 2 small coins. Not enough to do much of anything. They probably wouldn't have been enough money to feed a mouse, let alone say anybody for any length of time. So in one way you could argue that it didn't really make much difference what she did with her last 2 coins. My guess is that she probably tried to give it quietly when nobody was looking because it was so little. After all, the rich people who came gave large sums and everybody could see exactly what they gave. It was more a look of show as much as substance. So in some way, the widow's 2 coins was not very much. But if you look at it another way, it was an enormous gift. It was a symbolic gesture. It showed to herself and to God what was important to her. When her money was nearly gone, she chose to place her faith in God. She chose to trust in God that God would somehow take care of her. Would we give our last 2 coins to God for the same reason? Would we have followed a prophet who told us not to be afraid and to go home and make that last meal, not knowing what the outcome would be? I thought long and hard about that this week, and I'm not so sure. How about you? Long before we were close to broke, most of us, I think, would have given up on God. After all, how can God be good if you pray to God daily, hourly for financial help, and you keep getting poorer and poorer and poorer? How could you love a God who sends you to the poor farm? The widows experienced that nasty slide downward, and they still believed in God. They still loved God. They loved and trusted God through it all. And that is why they're in our Bible, because their faith was so extraordinary. In our Old Testament lesson, the widow was saved. Scripture never records what happened to the widow in Mark's Gospel, but I can't believe that after Jesus had pointed the widow out, that the disciples would have let her starve. But today's lesson also teaches us something different. What does it take for us to have extraordinary faith? We learned last week on All Saints' Day that part of our faith depends upon the saints who came before us, those people who showed us faith, the people who taught us faith and lived out faith by example. But today's lesson also teaches us something different. Part of the faith that we have depends upon us. We choose to have faith when we are taught faith and shown faith, of course. But at some point, it becomes our faith as well. We learn faith. Day by day, we learn faith. We learn faith as a child, and now as adults, the continued learning in the language of faith is up to us to continue on the path that our families set us on. I'm learning Spanish a few minutes a day. I spend about 10 minutes each morning. It doesn't seem like much, but this morning my computer tells me that I'm in my 151st day. 151 days at 10 or 15 minutes a day is 1,510 minutes, or almost 38 hours and 90 hours a year. According to my brother, linguist, I should be fluent in about 3 or 4 years. In the same way, any of us can learn the language of faith. The widows certainly did, trusting day by day, hour by hour, as their resources dwindled. So can we in our lives. So how can we learn faith? Faith exercises is what I call them. Count your blessings daily. Understand that things are seldom as bad as they seem. And most of us have been around long enough to realize that very fact. Spend some time regularly on helping others, whether it be the mustard seed or in the church nursery. If we focus on helping others, it's easier to have courage. But we can't do it just once. Scott Beck, who wrote the famous book, The Road Less Traveled, a few years ago, was a psychologist, and he worked with many people who were depressed. Now, depressed people, I think by very nature, have a hard time believing in that and having much faith. So finally, after treating this woman for many months, he told her to go to a local hospital and just visit folks that were worse off than she was. And she did. And the next time, when he came back and he saw her again, she said, "Yes, I saw people." He said, "So how did it go?" She said, "Oh, it was really a wonderful experience. It really made me feel good to do that." And Scott Peck simply said, "Great. So now you know what to do. You just have to keep doing that every once in a while. Keep up with it." The woman went away sad because she said, "You mean I have to do that every day?" We do have to practice the language of faith every day. Elijah told the widow not to be afraid. Jesus likewise tells us not to be afraid. So what are our fears today? Money? Finding the right pastor? Medical issues? Whatever they are, if we give our fears to God, bit by bit, every day, God will teach us courage. With the faith of a widow, two widows, we need not be afraid. Finally, there's something else I wanted to point out about our scriptures today. Our God is full of surprises. The people in the Old Testament never would have guessed that widow was lifted up as an example of faith. Certainly the example that we had in past, was it last Sunday or the Sunday before last, about the blind man and the widow today. These are not people that back in biblical days they would have thought, "Oh wow, these people have faith." And yet Jesus points out that appearances are not what they seem. So it is that if we trust in God, bit by bit, day by day, we can expect surprises. We can expect some interesting experiences that never would have expected. I wouldn't have expected to catch my first walleye. I wasn't expecting to come to northern Minnesota at all. But I've really enjoyed the time that I've spent here so far. In the same way, we need to learn to expect that our God can work in extraordinary ways. That when we have the faith of the people that you least expect, that amazing things will happen.